All right. Hi, everyone. It's really good to see folks in 3D after so long. You all out there can't see, but there are people in the actual room that I'm standing in. So sorry that those who are joining us on the stream can't be with us in person. And I do hope that we continue these talks and run them with larger and larger audiences, real audiences. For me personally, the electricity and the chemistry of being physically around people is something quite magical that I think, like many of us, I've only truly begun to appreciate, like so many things, when it's absent. So today I'm excited to talk about how we at Two Sigma think about engineering careers. And let me at the outset bring up the disclaimer slide. So yes, this is the disclaimer, the legal disclaimer slide, but there is another disclaimer that's probably worth mentioning. In business, particularly in this human side of the business, we tend to be groupies. We go after the latest fad, and I'm not going to mention any of that. No books to read, no papers that I'm going to quote here. What you will hear are ideas from close to 2 decades of grappling with really hard people problems at Two Sigma. So who am I? Sorry, back up. It's always good to read off paper. More importantly, and here is the real disclaimer, companies actually don't have ethics. They don't have a culture and they don't have empathy. It's the people that make up those organizations that have those things. And at best, it's a group of like-minded people that at an instant in time drive the emergent edge of all of these ideas. That means that some people in your organization don't think that way and others won't experience the things that you label as culture. The topic of this talk is no different. These are my observations and ideas that like-minded folk in engineering management at Two Sigma tend to hold and mold for what we believe is a better culture and ultimately business. And any incongruent observations and bad ideas are mine and mine alone. So who am I? So my name is Matt. Many at Two Sigma refer to me by my initials as MIG. I've been at Two Sigma for coming on 19 years, longer than I would have ever imagined. And when I joined Two Sigma, we were about 30 people. And I've been privileged to watch and to take firsthand action in growing the business to where we are today, which is close to a couple of orders of magnitude more larger in just about every dimension. Along the way, I think it's fair to say that we've really helped change the way the world thinks about investing. And I think that we've done that through one thing and one thing alone, and that's the people we hire and how we think about them. So I wear a number of hats at the company. As Chief Innovation Officer, advisor to our ventures organizations, and more permanently, for the sake of this talk, as Head of Investment Management Engineering. Where as a senior member of engineering staff, I get to think about how to lead and motivate the hundreds of engineers that work for our organization. So, who are you? I'm making the assumption that broadly speaking, those watching this presentation fall into one of 3 groups. New or about to be new graduates looking for your first role and wondering what a future will be, looks like that will be longer than your current life. Mid-career folk who may or may not be at a fork in the road, wondering if this is as good as it gets and how they can drive their own direction. And perhaps some engineering leaders pondering the same problems that we've pondered for the last couple of decades. In the next roughly 45 minutes, I'm going to set context, talk about what I think a career is and how we think about them at Two Sigma, and give you some tips on charting your own, or those for the folk that work with and for you. But before I talk about careers, if I can click properly, there you go. But before I talk about careers, I think it's worthwhile spending a few minutes on how we build and promulgate culture across the company and how that relates to building a career. So here's the highlight. It's not the food, right? We have Bagel Tuesdays and Food Truck Wednesdays. There's great food in the pantries. And plenty of ideas get discussed over coffee, but food is just that sticky fuel that brings us together. And we hire nice people, generally introverts. And together it's those people that create our culture. But to promulgate the culture, you need a language and a vocabulary that expresses those ideas that you care deeply about. After all, language is the blood of the soul into which thoughts run and out of which they grow. The people I meet frequently ask what is in the magic source of Two Sigma. And there are many, many answers to this question. But when I think about it, they boil down to a few things that they have in common. And they are that we have a scientific culture, that we are inquisitive, and that we tend to ask just one more question than the next person. I'm going to explain my understanding of each of these things and why I think they specifically add to the magic source. And then I'll talk about my favorite methodology to keep the magic. So what does it really mean to say that we have a scientific culture? And how does that distance us from other technology or finance companies? So simply put, it means that we take nothing at face value. Everything that we do should have a reason beyond X said so, or because that's the way we do things around here. But we have a construct to do this that comes from science in its most general meaning. We do what we do because there's some underlying hypothesis that we believe in. And we believe in that hypothesis because we have a set of facts that lend a more than 50% credence to proof of that hypothesis at the current time and place in our history. It allows us both to challenge our behaviors, to change our behaviors and our ideas, and also to acknowledge the past without ridiculing it. And that's important. The Earth, as you see here, was once believed to be flat, not because the people of that time were less clever, aware, or enlightened than we are, but because they didn't have the data to disprove that hypothesis. Once they did, the hypothesis changed, and the Earth, in fact, is not flat. An indispensable part of continuing this culture is being inquisitive. Why at Two Sigma is never a four-letter word, and why almost always highlights some gap in our communication mechanisms. We're not the best at communicating. We all have a lot to say, and it's sometimes both exhausting to write and to read, which is why communication is one of the hardest things to get right at any age, for any size, in any organization. And that problem is compounded at Two Sigma by our tendency to be introverted. After all, why would you communicate if you can understand the argument, weigh every side, and come to a better than average decision all in your head? Well, as my wife constantly reminds me, doing this deprives us of our ability to collaborate and reach a better than average decision. But asking why can also highlight imperfections in our hypotheses, requiring us to reevaluate the data. And that's key, because it's only in updating our priors and questioning our hypotheses that we can grow as an organization and continue to develop our platform to solve the hard business problems that we have to solve in order to deliver value for all of our investors. And finally, if I can, let's try it again. Just one more question. So this is closely related to our culture of being nice geeks. So for me, the definition of being a geek, and I'm one of them, proudly, is having a slightly unhealthy obsession with something. And that something could be anything, whether it's how best to use airline miles, finding or building the best keyboard, training for some event, or learning about something new. There's someone always at Two Sigma who can give you just a little bit more information than you probably want. And at the core of every geek is the desire to ask just one more question that might seem reasonable to help them understand more deeply. But it's precisely that skill that will uncover new data that will help us reevaluate our hypotheses. So ask just one more question, always, because I guarantee you there are turtles all the way down, as I like to say. So if those ingredients are the magic sauce, how do we ensure that we persist in being inquisitive, asking that extra question, and continuously evaluating our hypotheses? The one core tool that we use are models. This unbelievable quote is frequently on my mind. All models are wrong. Some models are useful. We tend to think We tend not to think deeply about it, but models are really core to our ability to navigate through life. We model behavior, we model ideas, we model people. So if we believe Box's statement, and I do, at least his first clause, then you have to ask the question, well, why would you model at all if all models are wrong? After all, you'll never get a good realization. So I believe that models are useful for three reasons. The first one is that models provide us with a common frame of reference, and within that frame, a common language. And that means that when we're observing what's expected by the model, our conversations can be shorter, richer, and more meaningful. The second is that models provide us with this boundary for testing our hypotheses. By paying careful attention to the gray zone, those observations that we expect to fall within the model but somehow don't, we begin to understand more about ourselves, our models, and our observables. And thirdly, models provide us with a platform upon which we can methodically increase our understanding of the problem that we're trying to solve. So we're all familiar with many models in our daily life. Anyone who's taken an introductory course on physics is introduced to the Newtonian model of dynamics. This model got us pretty far, machines, the industrial age, but it was that annoying perihelion precession of Mercury, the anomaly in the model, that drove us to find a better explanation, and ultimately general relativity, which itself has anomalies. It's important to know that the models that we have and rely upon go far beyond physics. In fact, we subconsciously rely on models to get us through every single day. So I want to introduce a couple more words that we use frequently at 2 Sigma, and they are epsilon and omega. And we use these words to describe goal setting and reaching in the forms of a mathematical journey. You can read more about the background and my thoughts on these in my insights blog, which is at 2sigma.com/epsilon. So in this model, omega, chosen because of its representation as the first ordinal number, is the end of the journey. And epsilon, chosen because of its representation as an infinitesimal amount of measure, is the smallest definite step to get there. So when we ask at 2 Sigma, what's your omega? What's your epsilon? We're embodying that the journey is long and may never end, for an omega contains a countable infinity of epsilons, but also that each step has a definite measure and direction. An epsilon represents an infinitesimal amount of work towards that omega. And like the frog, you're always jumping kind of maybe halfway there. Finally, one more word that we use frequently around 2 Sigma is context, as in setting context or having context. And as we build models and ask questions, we need to communicate our understanding to each other, and that communication heavily relies on context. And context is also directional. I like to think of it as an onion. As you move from inner layers to outer layers, you have more context to draw on to help inform. It's important to know that people who sit on the outer layers of the onion are not by any means more senior or high up in the organization or management structure. While it might be true that understanding the strategic value of a project within the strategy of an organization, I may have more context than a developer on the project. When we're talking about the features and usage of the project, that developer will have much more context than me. What is really critical is that when we have a conversation, we level set context for that conversation. Otherwise, we all get lost pretty quickly. So now I've introduced you to a bunch of words that I'm going to use again and again throughout this talk. This is what I intend to do with the remainder of the talk. I'm first going to set context. I'm going to lay out my models for thinking about a career in engineering. I'll lay out the hypotheses that I think I'm asserting. Then I will ask questions about my model and give some answers from a variety of perspectives. We'll talk epsilons and omegas, and there'll be turtles all the way down. And we'll examine this model at the variety of points that will occur in your career. And I might offer some unsolicited advice. Along the way, I'll bring examples from my time at 2 Sigma and insights into why we've made some of the decisions that we've made. What you won't find, as I said earlier in this talk, are references to books or papers on career growth or management. My advice is just to read them all. Although your hit rate of content to value might vary, I've rarely found a paper or book that I couldn't glean a single interesting piece of information from. And the reason is simply that this is more of a retrospective case study than a proposal. This is what we found works for us at 2 Sigma, and we continue to evolve and make it work for us as us changes. So for the purposes of this talk, my definition of a career is what you might see in the rear view mirror, side view mirror, I guess, over here, 30 years after you start college. That is to say, your career will happen whether you like it or not. It will largely be up to you how much you invest in it in order to make that career a fulfilling one. So while the old adage that no one dies wishing they'd spent another day at work might be true, work doesn't make up your career. Most of us spend a significant amount of time in our chosen roles. This was kind of my sketch of figuring out what I do during the day. And my assertion is that if I'm spending, probably 30 or more % of most of a significant chunk of my life doing something, then I want it to be meaningful in some sense. I'm incredibly lucky, we all are. Anyone who's watching this talk is incredibly lucky and privileged to not only to be able to choose what you do for a living, but to have that choice coincide with just one of the most sought after jobs in any industry today. Literally, the world is your oyster, but time is a hard taskmaster. So don't waste it. And if this holds true for me, that I don't want to waste any of this kind of gray portion of my life, then I'm asserting that it holds true for the kind of people that I want to attract, hire, and retain. And so it might be a platitude that we say we want to hire great people. But the real question that we asked ourselves many, many years ago is, what does that assertion mean and imply about the organization that we build and the choices that we create for our employees? So free food, gyms for the body and mind, that's what we call our hacker lab, and a good salary are really nice to have, but they don't by themselves imply a long-term meaningful career. And honestly, in the beginning, we really didn't think too much about these things. You can speak to me in gym afterwards. We really didn't. After all, as a startup, our first goal was to survive and thrive. And to that end, we hired experienced engineers who were team players and could help us bring online new streams of business. But as we became more successful and larger and older, we needed to answer just one key question. Should we expect our workers to stay? And if so, how do we incentivize them to do so? So it won't surprise you that the answer to the first question is a resounding yes. After all, the longer that you stay with an organization, in general, the more valuable you are to that organization. And that's not charity, that's simply good business. So this is kind of my base model. This is what I think your knowledge looks like as you stay at an organization. This isn't about the cost of training, it's about the knowledge and understanding that you gain and deploy. As an employee, the value and impact that you bring to your company in any given year really depends dramatically on your length of service. It's roughly proportional to the area under the graph. And that's really an observation about compounding knowledge. And once you arrive at this point, you're really faced with a conundrum. What else do you need to give an employee to make sure that they'll want to stay with you? At the same time that we were grappling with these questions, our increasing employee base were asking similar questions, albeit from an inverse perspective, many, many questions that I'll just boil down to 2. What's next and how do I get there? So you probably know the end to this story. In many ways, the answer looks like the same as the rest of the industry. We ended up with levels, but this is 2 Sigma. And for us, levels are a specific model of your career based on hypotheses that we believe to be correct. So every company roughly has the same kind of life cycle process for its employees. Every so often, perhaps twice a year, employees go through some kind of review. And we do this for empathic reasons because, everyone likes to know that they're doing well or not so well. and pragmatic ones, right? Some companies use these reviews to decide compensation, promotion, title, and perhaps very poorly to reinforce some weird understanding of power structure in the company. Two Sigma is no different, but year after year, as senior engineering staff reviewed the reviews, we began to notice that there were common themes that we were looking for in each individual, common expectations that we had that were being met or not being met, and common skills that we were increasingly having to teach our workforce. And we began to understand that we could group individuals by their ability in these skills. So for a number of years, we sat literally every 6 months and we sorted the engineering staff into groups. And the emergent property of this grouping was our level structure. And I have to say, even now, maybe a decade after we started doing it, there was this kind of profound feeling of satisfaction as we began to come up with the structure and language for describing an engineering career across Two Sigma. Early on, when I promoted an employee, they thanked me, but they explained that they had no idea why they received the promotion or why others had not. They explained to me, it's like I'm in a game being played with a ball. I know there's scoring and even in which direction the game moves, but I have no idea what the rules are. And I just felt at a loss as a manager of what to respond to this employee. So in many ways, our level structure and concomitant employee life cycle are really an answer to that confusion. So what is a level structure? You'll be familiar with the concept if you peruse levels.fyi. They're a set of typically numbers, but sometimes titles, with some direction indicating increasing seniority. At Two Sigma, we then imbue those levels with themes, for example, expertise, and indicate expectations at each level. So taken this way, levels are not interpreted as a reward structure, but rather as guidelines for the acquisition of skills that we perceive to be key in helping to lead and to run the engineering effort at this company, and I would venture to suggest at any technology company. The precise details of what's expected at each level within the job family that you inhabit, they're not important here. What is important is the model. Our hypothesis is that to attract and keep talent, we have to provide a rich, challenging environment with continuous learning and observed and rewarded growth. And our model for that is the level structure. And we surround and support that structure with programs for education and growth, goal setting and grading, and a promotion process tied to the knowledge that we want you to possess. We've put up guideposts that allow you to choose your own adventure. And each year, we expect each employee to take an active and intentional role in goal setting, deciding on the epsilons that they'll pursue over the coming goal period so they can track progress towards their own omega, whatever that is. So given that our levels are based around the acquisition and the display of knowledge, it's probably worth a few minutes talking about how we understand knowledge and how that interacts with a career. So we are not the first to think about this. In fact, if you search for I and T-shaped people, you'll find long discussions about how broad or narrow expertise factors into organizational dynamics. And at about the same time that we were thinking of these kind of models of career growth, we were reading these papers, these original papers, and trying to understand them in the context of our own employee base. And we found them constricting. And using them, we were unable to advance our conversation. And that's a good indication that the model is just not correct. Someone joked that we needed N and M people and perhaps centipede. There's an understanding that every individual has a panoply of skills that they bring to the role at various levels. And there is definitely something here. So what we'll do is we're going to flip the images. So here we go. I've taken the I and the T, but in fact, you don't need that bar. That's not the point. The point is that we want to indicate that this person has a breadth of skills, of talent, but it's fairly shallow, and we represent that by multiple columns, all fairly small. So now we can begin to understand what knowledge growth over a career looks like. As you increase your set of new skills, you broaden your base, and as you invest in deepening those skills, those columns grow. So as I showed in that graph earlier, one of the truly amazing things about knowledge is that if you invest in it, it compounds with time. The knowledge of any typical subject that you take over year 1, year 2, year 3 really does grow exponentially. So I think that after a while, an individual skill set might look like this. So if we order those from kind of largest to smallest, then you can kind of draw over them the surface of your skill set, and that's where you want to go. I'm a geometer. Once upon a time, I was a geometer, so that's kind of maybe complicated. Instead, we can think about a spider chart. And so on this spider chart, we can talk about your career growth, right? So on this spider chart, what you see is what's shaded is where you are. Each one of those arrows represents a dimension of a skill that you're trying to do. And the little teal squares over there are kind of indication of a level n+1. And so this indicates where you need to grow to get to the next level. So as you move between levels, your graph of knowledge or expertise might look something like this. Now, look, there's plenty thing wrong with this model. Knowledge, for example, is rarely gained in 0 time, but it highlights the relationship between knowledge acquisition, which is fairly quick sometimes, and mastery, which takes much more time, and that's the kind of the lines that go up. And that's key. So you learn a bunch of skills, then you begin to master them, and finally you demonstrate the requisite expertise for the next level, and then you go up to the next level and you do the same thing all over again. So this part of your career growth is vital for a number of reasons. So firstly, it's where the biggest disconnect can arise between you and your manager or yourself. After all, you've learned some new skills. And sometimes we really think that that's it, right? I've learned the skills, that's all I need to do. So whenever I catch myself in a situation, I reflect on the long hours that I've put into learning languages, where fluency, where I'm becoming fluent, right? Because fluency and expertise are fairly synonymous. And secondly, these are the points in your career where you have real agency over. Building expertise is all about taking on new challenges or projects that utilize the skills you've learned, and you want to have the choice on each task whether to increase this gradient, and along with that, the anxiety in the completion of the task, or lower the gradient and potentially increase the burden of the challenge. And so you can bring in your ability to move to the next level or kind of push it out by changing that gradient. And you'll likely want to do a mix, right? That's why if you went to college in the States where you had options and things to do, you may have taken, for example, an advanced course on economics and physics for poets, right? Because it's about balancing the effort that you do so that you can put your best foot forward in the direction of your omega. I love this model because it's a really great model for thinking, not just about each piece of learning that you assimilate, but it also reflects the complexity of the learning process. And it also helps explain a bunch of things. So when you begin your first job, you've actually already begun your career. Remember I said from the beginning of college, right? There was a reason. You may have had some internships, and you've almost surely spent a significant amount of time at school at learning some skills. So in fact, the beginning of your career looks like this. You're leaning on knowledge that you learned outside the workplace and learning to use that knowledge in the workplace. So one of the things that I hear from Newts, which is what we call our early employee program, on occasion, is that they're frustrated and they see other people up for promotion and they don't understand why. After all, they may have been at 2 Sigma exactly the same amount of time. And sometimes they were in the same school, the same classes, and even got the same grades, right? We are definitely a competitive and ambitious bunch at 2 Sigma. The university is a great equalizer in the following sense. When you take a course in programming at university, it doesn't matter whether you've never touched code before or whether you've been Minecrafting since you were 6. Everyone can get it. And few of us are cognizant of the work that others put into each assignment. And so almost invariably, when I kind of root around to understand what's really going on, I find that the early promotee was someone who's probably been programming since they were young and has had much more real world experience. And so it kind of looks like this. right? You take that whole graph that we were looking at, and then we just kind of shift that backwards. This is exactly why I think the explanation for what we see, for the things that we see. This model also helps explain why the journey from level to level might look quite different for each individual. We don't really see the full knowledge radar map for each individual until we're actually looking for those skills. That means you might bring with you quite a huge amount of knowledge and experience when you enter the workplace that might not be visible to everyone except for you. So here's an example from my life. When I first began managing, not at 2 Sigma, someone in my management team complimented me that I was quite a good manager for someone with little or no experience. Of course, what she didn't see, because it isn't even on my resume, is that I spent the latter part of a decade in my late teens and early 20s creating and running youth camps, where I both learned and maybe mastered many of the skills that I use today in management. So this is kind of how I think about early career levels. Let's talk about those early levels for a little bit. If you don't amass new knowledge, then what's actually happening in those first few levels? Well, working in any endeavor that's made up of people is fundamentally different from the first couple of decades of your life. Up until you enter the workplace full time, you are, for the most part, involved in a single player game. And now that you begin to work all the time amongst an ever-changing group of people on tasks that are part of a much larger organization, writing code that will be used day in, day out for likely decades. At 2 Sigma, we have code running here that's older than some of the people who work here. That isn't because we're lazy. That's a reflection of the fact that code that works, at least in this day and age, doesn't actually need to be changed that often. And writing code that lasts means gaining expertise in thinking on a much longer time horizon than the next semester, the next quarter, or the next year. It means thinking about how you'll explain that code to the people who will use and extend it, perhaps years after you've left the organization. It means learning how to work in a team whose composition isn't up to you and changes with time. And it means gaining expertise in taking vaguer and vaguer problem statements and turning them into full solutions on longer and longer time horizons that you define. So here's the thing. What you learned in college will only get you so far. Eventually, you may become an expert, but without learning anything new, your career will stall. And that's kind of actually an oversimplification, right? All human beings learn continuously. We can't help it. And certainly the kind of curious folks that we hire are lifelong learners. What the level structure and the associated yearly processes do is force you as the employee and me as management to make intentional decisions about what, when, and how you learn. In this way, as I noted earlier, your career, it really does become a kind of a choose your own adventure. And even not choosing is a choice, a poor one in my estimation, but a choice nonetheless. And these choices are always there and become more evident after a few years. We tend to spend a lot of angst on decisions that we envision will be decisive for our career. Let me give you one example. Here at 2 Sigma, as elsewhere, we have managers, right? Those are people whose primary responsibility is over the growth and care of other human beings. And we have individual contributors whose primary responsibility is over the growth and the care of the software systems that we build. For fairly pragmatic reasons, we only begin the management track at a fairly senior level because we demand that all of our managers are highly technical and have work experience. And we feel that this sets them up best for managing others, those software engineers. And so at some point, I always have this conversation with engineers about this huge choice about whether to go the management track or the individual contributor track, as if these are one-way routes. And it can seem that way if you have no model for a career. But with the model that we've developed, the question is really whether these are the skills you want to learn and master and whether you want to do that right now. And the question isn't applicable to the decision over manager or IC, but a general question that you should ask yourself continuously, along with a pre-question of what skills do you actually want to learn. So a fork in the road might well be that, but it could also be a fascinating dead end or a loop or any other path. And I've personally taken many of these. At one point, you see, I was a theoretical physicist with a passion for quantum gravity. Ex post facto, that was a very dead end. But I learned so much then that I still apply today, right? That's the little tinges of red in the graph here. And here at 2 Sigma, I decided at one point to try a fundamentally different job as a quantitative modeler. It was an immensely fulfilling time in my career. And even though I'm no longer in that part of the business, what I do today is directly and causally related to what I did then. So you might think that 2 steps backwards seems to be backwards, but it is 2 steps, and only time will tell whether it was backwards. And so at some point, you hit mid-career. You've got many skills, you've got a lot of experience, and the world is still your oyster. This should be like the most exciting time of your career. Yet when we looked at the data, it just didn't seem to be the case. What we saw was what I call our own uncanny valley, which is a kind of a negative response in happiness, just when we're expecting a positive one. And so we dug into responses, we dug into the data, and we found that a central concern was a perceived lack of agency and autonomy. Now, I say perceived because I know that from a senior management perspective, that certainly wasn't the intent. And nevertheless, it was definitely there, sitting in the data, just staring back at us. And so after much back and forth in case studies, we think we kind of finally understood what was happening. So you remember my onion, right? The onion of context. The question is, how does that model of context interact with the levels model that we're building? So here I'm going to bring yet another analogy, that of an ecosystem, let's say a rainforest. This is the kind of complexity that we're talking about when we're building the platforms at 2 Sigma. As an early career engineer, you are a gardener. You're responsible for the trees. You have the agency and the autonomy on a very local level to help your tree thrive. As you grow, that context shifts to the forest. That's the scope that you have, and your context begins to shift from a local to, say, a kind of a neighborhood level. And at senior levels, your view is across the whole ecosystem. Here, single trees, honestly, they're not my concern. Rather, the large-scale phenomena that are endemic to the ecology as a whole. And whilst that's a nice story, it really does highlight the differences in purpose of the roles in the organization as you become more senior. So back to our mid-career concerns. Agency is the capacity, condition, or state of acting or of exerting power. That is, you know what needs to get done, you just feel powerless and ineffective. This can actually happen at all levels, and usually is the result of missing context. So there's the onion on which you're sitting on the outermost layer. Say you're leading a project. And in the course of that project, you begin to understand that some technical direction that you chose would in fact be beneficial to the whole engineering organization, and you are very passionate about it. So you go around telling everyone who listen that this change is really important and desperately needed, and you're frustrated because nothing is happening. You feel a lack here of agency. Let me tell you that that's not because your solution is bad. It's simply that your choice, while good for your project, might not take into account the next level of the onion, the high level context. So more importantly, you as the messenger are not perceived by the organization as having enough context to make that decision for the whole organization. And that's a real frustration, and we can solve that from both sides. Firstly, from your perspective, finding the person who has that context and making sure they understand the benefits and will help drive the solution that you want. Secondly, from my perspective as management, listening to the organization. My goal is to successfully grow and evolve the ecosystem. But without listening to those gardeners, we'll never understand where the ecosystem actually is. So autonomy is something slightly different. It's the freedom to act or function independently. And in this case, it isn't about driving a proven solution through the larger organization, for example. It most likely happens around an idea that you just can't get off the ground and leads to your perception that you have just no freedom to act. Usually in these cases, we found the cause is just one of two things. Either there is context that you should have, but you're missing. and so it really isn't going to get off the ground. Or do you have context, but you're unable to communicate the value of your idea appropriately? And I use that word appropriately specifically here to indicate not that you're unable to communicate, but that you haven't found the right communication mechanism for the people that you need to communicate to in order to get your idea across, right? In computer science speak, right, you haven't learned their API. These feelings of lack of agency and autonomy are most keenly felt during your mid-career, because that's precisely where the runway of knowledge that you learn in school begins to peter out. Back to our rainforest analogy, all of these people work closely together to look after the whole ecosystem. But as you move between roles, you require significant and different skills. And as you move through your mid-career levels, it really is the case that what got you here won't get you there. In our simple graph of career, this looks like another step function. But the question is, how do you overcome that step without understanding the new skills that you need to acquire these mid-levels, for example, around communication, leadership, strategic development? This step becomes a very hard step to climb indeed. And that's exactly what our levels models attempts to address, because you think that your spider chart looks like this when actually it kind of looks like this. Frustrating, to be absolutely sure, but it's also a map for your next set of epsilons. So perhaps the one place this is really obvious in first-time managers moving across the individual contributor manager boundary. So these folk have spent the early part of their careers being deeply involved in the projects they're working on, likely coding much of the time, and they enjoy it. We all do. Delegating that development to your team, not all of whom write code exactly the way you want them to write, might be difficult. And I know that from experience. In a previous company, my first role as team lead was incredibly exciting. I had this definite vision for what I wanted to produce and a way that I wanted to see that vision executed. My team, less so. And I had this really, really poor habit of staying extra late at work and rewriting all of the APIs and code they checked in to make the project more beautiful from my perspective, at least. I was unaware of the effect that this had on the team until they all upped and left. They came to me en masse, and in the nicest possible way, they explained to me that I had this vision they were unable to keep up with, and I've got it, I can do it, and they were just a drag on a project, so they're going to find another project. You see, I was using all of the skills that I developed as a single contributor to drive the project forward, and was not learning any of the real skills that I needed to drive the team forward. And even over 2 decades later, that still haunts that initial failure. So we should learn from them. So as you grow through mid-career with all of your infinity of possibilities, make sure that you're tending to your skill set. Make it a habit to read widely on skills that you don't have, but are evident amongst those roles that you'd like to grow into. So this is also a perfect time to experience more of the organization by moving around. At 2 Sigma, we value mobility highly because it's beneficial for the employee and for the organization. As an employee, you get to apply the skills you've already mastered in a new domain, picking up more valuable knowledge along the way. And the organization benefits from this movement by sharing best practices and common values and language across the whole enterprise, which brings me onto my final point for a mid-career person. It's important to find yourself a mentor or more than one. Sometimes it's your manager, but that's not a requirement. It should be someone that you can brainstorm with about where you are and where you want to go, and can help you highlight skills that you don't have or that you need to improve. I think here it's important to point out that sometimes we need skills for a role that we don't want to learn. This is a conversation that I have fairly frequently. That is, you've identified the skills needed for the next level. You understand what those skills are, but you're just not interested in amassing them. Right? The conversation usually plays out in one of 2 ways. So the first way typically is a conversation something like, hey, Mig, you know, you want me to learn all of these project management skills, but I'm just not really organized. I've really got no interest in learning that. And anyway, we have these professional project managers, so why do I need to do it? So this is a mismatch in expectation about the amount of knowledge you need to know. So I'm certainly not expecting software engineers to excel at project management. It's a different job family after all. But rather to expand your ability to lead and impact the organization there are some aspects of project management that you have to be comfortable with, so you can move up to that kind of next layer of the onion and have more context. In the same way, at Two Sigma, we require our project managers to have technical skills. These skills help set context for the onion layer that you're moving towards. The second way this plays out is that the employee either becomes enamored with the new skill set, potentially leading to a change in role, which is great, or they wrestle trying to learn more skills than they need, right? So sometimes we hire perfectionists and they just want to learn everything. At which point it's important to learn that there are very few people who are actually good at everything. And attempting to perfect skills that are not in your wheelhouse, whilst it might be admirable, is probably not the best bang you can have for your buck of time. Instead, hone in on the skills that you are truly good at and make those your superpowers. So as you continue to grow in your career and become senior, what's next? Well, back to EF Box. Right? This has been a useful model, but it's wrong. The models that we've created don't actually address what it means to be senior in your level or in your career. So now I'm off model and probably off script, but this is what I tell my senior leaders. In some sense, being a senior leader gives a tremendous sense of achievement, but there can also be a profound sense of loss. And when Alexander saw the breadth of his domain, he wept, for there were no more worlds to conquer. That isn't the benefit of too many movies, rather than a classical education, but it does represent the grief. On the other hand, in a very real way, becoming senior is about beginning something new. It's about using the sum total of skills that you've gained in your career to drive the organization forward to a better place. And that is the essence of the actual, not the Hollywood quote, but the actual quote. Alexander wept when he heard the discourse about an infinite number of worlds. When his friends inquired what ailed him, he said, "Is it not worthy of tears that when the number of worlds is infinite, we have not yet become lords of a single one?" Welcome to senior leadership. You thought this was the end. It's just the beginning. As a leader, you have a duty of care to the organization and to the people within the organization, and this just grows with seniority. It's critically important to understand that what you say has reverberations within the organization, not because you say it, but because the role that you inhabit says it. And in your role, sitting on the outer layers of the company onion, you are visible and you are listened to. One other thing that I will come back to here at the end of the talk and of your career is the notion of mobility. Opportunities here abound in every organization that you're likely to be a part of. You just sometimes need to look for them. And those opportunities don't cease magically at some senior level or after many years in your career. Everyone is richer for the different roles that they play throughout their career, and the opportunity to do something new with the tremendous experience that you've gained can provide immeasurable impact and benefits both to the organization and those that make up the organization as they see you take on new challenges. So let me try and summarize where we've arrived. I have discussed our use of levels and the attendant life cycle around those levels as a model for you, your life, your growth and career. The omega is kind of where you want to be, and the goals and the epsilons that get you there. And the plan, that's a map of your epsilon to omega. Now, if your goals are epsilons, then they need to have magnitude and direction. They need to move you along and also get you closer to where you want to be. The unwritten hypothesis here is that success actually requires you to amass skills, experience, and impact, and that the execution of goals gives you some of all of these. Success means different things to different people, and it takes a fair amount of time to figure out what it means for you, which you should do both through self-reflection and collaboration. Once you understand where you want to be, you can map out how you want to get there and what you might want to do this year or next year. But you still need to verify magnitude and direction. If it's a promotion that you're looking towards, then you can ask whether the goals you've set provide magnitude towards the promotion that you want to the next level. But you also need to ask yourself about direction. For this, you'll want to understand how your goals fit in with your team, organization, and business. That's why goals at every level are a collaboration between you and your manager. It's not because she manages you, but rather because she's likely to have a better understanding of the larger context and is thus more likely to understand whether your goals are directed appropriately. Having goals, though, is not enough. You need to be aware of them and how you're doing. I pin my goals above my desk at home so that you can make updates as time progresses. If you are a manager or other leader in the organization, then you're in a slightly different situation because you're going to have both your own epsilons and omegas, but you also be responsible for those of others that either report to you or are directed through the technology that you envision. Your role at this point entails multiple overlapping conversations up and down the leadership tree. And it's important to recognize that there are two I's in we. Your impact at this stage can be multiplicative across the organization, but you also need to focus on where you want to go, how you want to grow, and who you want to be. And finally, as a senior leader within the organization, recognize that the world is still your oyster. There are plenty of ways to continue to grow and to have impact. New is sometimes daunting, but it is always very exciting. However, in your role, you are responsible for those that you lead, and you have a duty of care to them and to your organization. That's why you're a senior leader. It's up to you to make it better for everybody. So in a few minutes, or in about a minute, we're going to break for Q&A. But let me give some notes for further information. I'll end with how I began. Two Sigma is magic because of the people that make up the organization. And this talk is no different. It was this unbelievable team effort from folks across the organization. And I really want to thank everyone deeply who got involved along the way. And to you out there and in here for zooming in or turning up. If you want any more information on Two Sigma, then the website is a great place to begin, www.twosigma.com. And if you're interested in working here, then www.twosigma.com/careers. And if it's me that you're after, then you can ping me on LinkedIn. Thanks everyone for listening. And now let's turn back to Jim for some questions that have come in on Slido.
So it is time now for our QA. That means we're going to go a little over time to take questions. We won't be offended if anyone has to leave for another appointment. I would also like to introduce Kyle Irwin in Engineering Talent Acquisition, who will be joining for some of the Q&A. I myself am going to go ahead and answer our most popular question. Yes, this session has been recorded and it will be up on our YouTube. As a reminder, please submit all your questions and upvote other people's using the slido.com using the event name TS Presents. TS, one word, presents, all in one word. So let's see, what's our top question? This goes to Matt. What approach do people take who successfully launch new initiatives within the company?
So it's a great question. And I think maybe I'll rephrase it. What do successful people at the company look like? Is that maybe?
I think that's the same spirit, yeah.
Spirit that we're talking about. So, you know, some of the things I talked about, right? If you don't have that inquisitiveness, if you're not willing to ask one more question, then it's quite difficult to get things off the ground. And they have a persistence that they want to understand how they can roll their ideas or their new business out. And sometimes that's not a straight path, right? This is not the day and age when anyone can stand up and say, go and do this. That never happens here. Even if we could, I wouldn't want it to happen because it makes for a pretty miserable workplace. Instead, what you have to understand is, what does that onion look like? Who do you speak to? How do you get your ideas across to the people who need to move them? Now, for some people, that might be called politics. That might be the dirty word, but politics is really divided into two. There's the nasty politics, and then there's the kissing baby politics. And I'm all for the kissing baby politics. We call that collaboration. We call that camaraderie. We call that making deep connections between people. And those people who succeed at Two Sigma are those people who are like spiders in the middle of the web, who really reach out and speak to everyone and understand what's going on across the organization.
I remember it took me a long time to learn the kissing baby politics, but it's valuable and actually very personally rewarding too. I think this one is for you as well. How do you choose between mastering a certain field skill versus being average in multiple fields and skills, especially as someone just beginning their career? Yeah,
it's a really fundamentally great question. I found that the answer to this question is actually very cultural. You know, in America, there's this kind of great desire to kind of better yourself, to really, you've got to, you know, do everything. In England, where I'm from and where we're speaking right now, less so. In England, take what you'll get at, make yourself better at it. One thing that everyone, I am sure, who is watching this talk has for them is that we are all the beneficiaries of a phenomenal education. Again, as I said, in this industry that is only growing from here. And so we actually have the ability to take a deep breath. And someone once asked me, how did you succeed in your career? I'm like, I'm not sure I succeeded in my career, but I will tell you that the times in my career where I relaxed were both the times that I had the most fun and surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, the times where I had the most impact. So, you can afford yourself to take a deep breath and do what you like doing, because chances are that if you like doing it, you're pretty good at it.
Am I having fun is a really good barometer for am I on the right track? It's fun that way.
Absolutely.
I think this is a Kyle question, and that is it better for my career growth to stay in the same team or to move around between teams?
Yeah, I guess I could take that from a recruiting perspective, right? I'd say that's it's really indicative of the individual and what they're wanting to do, right? I think, from a recruiting standpoint, and I know at Two Sigma, of course, we love people, when we look to find an initial team for somebody to join, of course, we want them to, thrive in that team, learn and grow for potentially multiple of years, right? But ultimately, as they continue to grow their career at Two Sigma, what we would want them to do is to work with their management line, to determine if there's continued growth in that area, in that team, or potentially opportunity to break out into other areas. And I think it's a lot of it's within the story, right? And really figuring out kind of what motivates you, kind of what empowers you in your career, really defining that, and is very important. And of course, having an organization that, of course, will work with you, towards, to that end, is equally as important. Right. And so, I'd say overall, you kind of have to look introspectively, in terms of kind of what you're looking to get out of your career into potentially an organization like Two Sigma. Again, I'd say, it is important. You always see that to stick out in a specific team and to really, kind of make an impact there. But ultimately, if you do decide that for your career, for the things that you're trying to achieve, you might need to branch into other areas and learn new skills or get associated with different areas or aspects of the business. I think that's, something that, of course, is justifiable as well.
I think we've got one more on this to Matt. What strategies are good for prioritizing the work that has to get done versus the work that you want to do?
So I'm actually not a good person to answer this one. I kind of find everything interesting. It's not really good. I understand there are people who don't like doing X, Y, or Z. I was never a computer scientist by training. And so everything is interesting, even sometimes the most mundane tasks, right? Mr. Miyagi painting the fence are interesting. But I think, part of that is part of the answer there is that you can find interesting puzzles where you least expect them. And so what I would encourage, again, is to come back to some of the things we've talked about. The asking one more question is reasonable. It may well be that something you're doing is boring, but if you kind of peel back and look at the turtles underneath, something interesting may pop out. I could wax eloquent or less eloquent about this for a long time, but there you go. Yeah.
Excellent. This one got upvoted. What epsilons should I set if my omega is to work for Two Sigma or a company similar to Two Sigma?
All right, so I will give you the advice that I first actually heard from my brother. So it's when he was going for his first job. He came back, he said, I got the job. I said, how do you know I got the job? He just had one interview. He goes, I knew more about the company that I was interviewing for than the interviewer. And so one of the things that we can tell about Two Sigma, look, you have to have the requisite skills, you have to pass the coding test, you have to be kind of good at what you do. But let's assume you're that. The more you understand about where you're coming, the more attractive you make yourself for the interviewers you speak with and ultimately the company. And so if you walk into Two Sigma and you've kind of, done your homework, as it were, understand about the organization, understand why you want to come, you make yourself much more attractive than someone who rolls up and can't actually answer that question. Why finance? Why Two Sigma? Something like that. So do your homework.
So I'm gonna say that's all the time we have for, as we've gone 10 minutes over. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you, Matt, for an amazing talk. I really appreciate your time. To learn more about Two Sigma, check out our blog at twosigma.com/insights, where you will also find the article Matt referenced, or twosigma.com/epsilon. You can also check out any current openings at twosigma.com/careers. And if you have any questions regarding applications, you can contact recruiting@twosigma.com. Thank you all very much, and have an excellent day, whatever time zone you may be in.
Thanks.